Again, my gratitude, Professor Gamrat, for the extensive and kind survey. This is just to focus on the Hallelujah effect, and that made the cover, which is always nice, when it first appeared, 2013. It's a really great cover illustration, and so the press just took it over for music studies. Then they went out of business. I hope it wasn't because of that, but it was then republished by Routledge. Now, a monograph should only have one theme monograph, but this particular text has three. The first part looks at Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah as all-purpose hit, along with the notion, that's probably the most radical part of the book, on male desire and music. For those interested in critical theory, the culture industry, there's a second core on Adorno and Günther Anders, because Günther Anders, whom I just wrote a book on, he was, as Gunther Stern, a sociologist of music, and he wrote extensively on music. We'll have a tiny reference to him, along with Herbert Eimert, who took one of his poems and made a radio composition. And there's a third part, which is the reason for the book, on Nietzsche, Beethoven, and ancient tragedy. That is literally the goat song, as Nietzsche had discovered that ancient Greek poetry was sung rather than spoken. I wrote the book in correspondence with Leonard Cohen's lawyer because it cost major money, and I paid Sony, I didn't pay Cohen, to quote his Hallelujah, but I also wrote it in correspondence with a musicologist, Ernest McLean, who focused in his research on music and numbers in the Hebrew Bible and Egyptian, Indian, and all kinds of other traditions. He was very, very broad. He also had some interesting reflections, and there's the ones I'm going to be drawing on today, on time and decay. And he defined a musical comma, any comma, as a useless micro-interval, he was an arithmetician, which results, I'm quoting MacLean, from a trivial natural cyclic excess in the 2-to-3 ratios of the musical fifths, but an annoyance, as he said, when allowed to accumulate. Now, he identified what he's talking about in a diagram, which he contributed to a Festschrift for a Jesuit teacher of mine, a priestly view of biblical arithmetic. And he defines what he calls Satan's comma, and that's the difference, very few people talk about it, but it's going to be important for this discussion, between 666 perfect fifths, octave reduced, and a single perfect fifth, a difference which cannot be heard. And this is something MacLean emphasized. I knew him personally, and thus, as Leibniz would say, a difference that makes no difference. Similarly, for Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, who was a student of Messaien, and Stockhausen refers to the accumulation MacLean mentions, he doesn't mention MacLean, of an interval, a comma, you can not hear, a comma, an interval you cannot hear, reflecting that distorted presentations of Lucifer's formula, Stockhausen makes it more dramatic, lead, it works this way no matter what you do, to its destruction over the course of time. Goethe, the German poet, who's very Lutheran, holds rectification as Mephisto's self-definition, permuting deities as confounding evil. And I'm going to quote that later, but here, Faust raises the challenge of the poetological caesura, will stillstand, verweile doch, du bist so schön, and that's all about the moment, Augenblicke, very, very tiny interval. Theodicy, as justification or tuning. I was inspired in writing this by Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy, Out of the Spirit of Music, and Nietzsche's attention to Beethoven, given the cliché conviction, everybody knows, that Nietzsche was obsessed with Wagner. I had trouble with that because I read the book, and it clashes with the emphases in The Birth of Tragedy, beginning with the title vignette, you see it there, which refers to Beethoven's Die Geschöpfe des Prometheus. Prometheus, as you will remember, originally created humanity. See the flame, right? It was one of the first ones to fashion the human being. and a disquisition, Nietzsche talks about that in the book, and a disquisition on the Ode to Joy, Schiller, in Beethoven's transcription in the first section of the book. And Nietzsche ends his book with more Beethoven, with a reflection, very provocative, on what he calls the becoming a human. The German is Menschwerdung der Dissonanz. Now, there's actually a thesis that I was a second reader on, which argues that Nietzsche anticipates Stravinsky. I think that's probably wrong, but it's a beautiful formula. The emancipation of dissonance, the Menschwerdung der Dissonanz, sounds lovely. And you could make the case that already at the beginning of the 19th century, Friedrich Hölderlin had given this a formulaic expression in his Sophocles, viele versuchten umsonst, das Freudigste, freudig zu sagen. Hier spricht endlich es mir, hier in der Trauer sich aus. Nietzsche's first book made the case that playing with dissonance, that is the unpleasant, the sting of displeasure, Stachel des Unlusts, was for Beethoven achieved at the level of the word. He thinks Beethoven does it with the word Freude. And it doesn't work in Polish, and it doesn't work in English, and it doesn't work in French. It only works with Freude. And it doesn't work, Pace Bernstein, of course, with Freiheit. It only works with Freude. So symphonically, Nietzsche argues with Wagner. He says if Beethoven went on, he would not go to opera. He would have composed the 10th symphony, because he put human voice into the orchestral instruments. That was Nietzsche's argument. In his notes, he quotes the Greek, I'm missing an H there, sorry about that, Archesilaus. The noble resides, however, in words, even in sounds. It is megalotonos. Okay, all that is way too much Greek. So I turned to Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, and we can hear a little bit, I hope. Now, I'm stopping that, but one of the things that we're looking here is to note that the line gives enough, and that's the question, and that's why I wrote to Ernest, to describe the chord, even if one brackets the song as such. Priest Cohen was by name, and given his life and his songs also vocation. His Hallelujah has inspired covers, of which there are countless candidates for favorites. An old cellist I used to play, as I am, I was not much of a fan of the favorite I chose, not per se, and I said as much when she irritated Katie Lang. When I met her in person, I never met her formally, I just met her on the street to give her a copy of my book in New York. I was in the middle of the street, but it was her version I found most evocative among the favorites. Jeff Buckley wins. Everyone loves Jeff Buckley. And if you're sophisticated, Bob Dylan.
Say there was a secret chord, but then it failed to please the Lord.
Dylan's version, like Cohen's version, is fairly plain song. And later, maybe I'll get to offer a little bit of Alan Rickman, the late English actor, singing from the other side of the grave, which rather changes the title. The sun ain't gonna shine anymore. I have an online lecture which one can look at discussing Katie Lang's 2005, which is what impressed me, Juno Awards presentation. And every one of those covers, including what we just heard, even Cohen, is actually a cover because John Cale came and made his song a song. So it's the cover of the original sung by the original singer. But we might hear now a little bit of her Hallelujah, which she sung in Leonard Cohen's presence at his induction in 2006, it took that long, into the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame. He was stunned, he tells us.
Heard there was a David played and it pleased the Lord.
Ernie McLean didn't care for Leonard Cohen. Pat Heelan didn't find her impressive either. He was a Jesuit, just not his thing. But McLean, neutral on fandom, was more concerned with gematria in the Hebrew Bible and Stoic commentary, the music in Plato, explaining the musical reasons for justice in the Republic in terms of right tuning. But for me, what was useful was that he was no nonsense. He was a good person to write because he wasn't, oh yeah, what a great idea. He was, oh yeah, what a terrible idea. That was very, very valuable. Great music professor, very, very decent. Protestant. McLean directed the choir at Oberlin College, and a performer. I was interested in writing on performance practice. He had played clarinet with some of the big bands. Nonsense, he said to me via email. I footnote this in the Hallelujah Effect. I have all my footnotes are full of McLean. Cohen's secret chord is no secret. It's the pop version of an endless melody. Wilfrid Mellors, more diplomatically, would say the same thing about Bob Dylan and the pentatonic. McLean argued that this would sell itself to any public or pop, easy manipulation. He wasn't wrong about the culture industry. I said that Adorno constituted the middle part of my book, and his description fits another variant. I don't have a slide, but you can find it. It's named for its own device, Unchained Melody. Righteous Brothers, good on YouTube. McLean wrote the Pythagorean Plato prelude to the song itself, along with an essay. I already showed an image of that, comparing Pythagorean, that's T3, tuning systems by way of a non-distributive lattice, which Heelan had invented, of partially, he was a mathematician, partially ordered sets. And as I said, he was a Jesuit, and this was the Festschrift for which he contributed the essay, Hermeneutic, Philosophy of Science, Van Gogh's Eyes, lots of art, and God, because he's a Jesuit, so theology. McLean argued that read backwards through varying tuning systems proportionate to the instruments of the time, ergo, archaeo-musicologically, yields so-called Pythagorean, there's a little red arrow, and McLean is careful. He has technical reservations about whether you should really call it Pythagorean tuning, and he has a diagram, another one, there it is, this figure 3, to illustrate the spiral of musical fifths. You can kind of see that there on the scale, and fourths. McLean has further clarifying precisions reading the Hebrew Bible from King David and beyond to Revelation, although McLean doesn't refer to either Messaien or Stockhausen. It's hard not to think of them when McLean writes, as he does, when New Jerusalem descends from the clouds at the end of Revelation, these forces are dwarfed by a chorus of 144,000 male virgins singing a new song reserved for them, accompanied by 24 angelic harpists. These integers, the male and the female are for McLean and for Pythagoras integers, define pentatonic and heptatonic modal tuning systems, which can be decoded by Heelan's algebra. Now, Heelan, who was my teacher and my friend, was bemused by McLean's decoding, which may both baffle and delight an attentive reader. Here, the difference will be the kind of tuning possible with a monochord. McLean had one. When I visited him in Washington, he would demonstrate that for me. Almost every music teacher has one, typically understood. I teach that all the time in terms of Plato's divided line. And pipes. And this got my attention because I care about the ancient Greeks. So you can think, if you want, about a syrinx. I do. That's an instrument that is, it's bronze. It's not, of course, in pottery. That's in pottery, but it's a pottery depiction of a bronze syrinx. But McLean is referring, and he had a good friend who also became my friend, to Mesopotamian harps as well. These are made of silver. Here I am, that's me a few years ago, with Richard Dumbrell, also a few years ago. And right behind us is the harp from the British Museum. I thank Patrick Huang a student of music for the photo, as Dumbrell has recounted the reconstructions and the pitfalls of archaeomusicology, and he has one of the first intonations of the Harrian hymn, one of the earliest recorded music, as well as the acoustic difference it makes a big difference. What harps are made of. I write about that as well with regard to of all people, Apollo. Once again, MacLean's Great Serpent and his Figure 4, illustrating spiral fifths tuning, as you see on harps and pitch pipes. As MacLean notes, this tuning order is visibly, you can see this, aurally, you can hear it, and tangibly serpentine. And then what he wants to talk about is the contrast. For MacLean, the resulting scale order, however, is almost straight line, as in Figure 5. You can see that there. Only in equal temperament can 12-tone scale order straighten the ancient Egyptian cosmic serpent Apophis perfectly. Caleb spies the Holy Land with Joshua, with the same accuracy shown by Vincenzo Galileo, that's the father of Galileo Galilei, who was a music maker in the 16th century AD, when this temperament science had to be reinvented because its Mesopotamian origin was forgotten. Plato no longer was read with musical comprehension. Kabbalism had lost its Davidic clarity, and a new concept of zero as nothingness had intruded on the old idea of the one as the point of origin. Ancient Greeks, and for 1,000 years, nobody had a zero. With MacLean's diagram, I did the layout by hand. Musical graphics are a huge challenge if you're writing a book, and especially if you want to throw in mathematics and logic, as MacLean did. So his Figure 11, we already saw, gives us an analysis of, he writes, of the sins of approximation forgiven within the septimal comma, 35 to 49, again to the next proportion, 50 to 70. He highlights, so we don't miss it right there, Satan's comma is greater than Isaac's, and if you look down, you will see the greater and the smaller. Musically, according to MacLean, as understood by the author of Revelations, Satan is not simply to be banished, but must be allowed, that's a quote from MacLean, his period on the throne of heaven for the resurrection drama to be completed by 888. Because I talk about Hallelujah, I can already cite Messaien, who tells us, as for Alleluias, we shall retain the greater part of them, Alleluatic vocalis, whose character our music will often have. Before I get to Messaien, I'll discuss Meatloaf and Bob Dylan, in addition, as I've already mentioned, ancient tuning systems. And I'll conclude, I've already cited, with Stockhausen, who for some will be problematic, perhaps because he, like Messaien, was raised Catholic. It's the only thing you're allowed to be prejudiced against, the Catholics. Anyway, or maybe, as Jocelyn Godwin, there's Stockhausen, Bavarian, so he's Catholic, argues in his essay Stockhausen's Donnerstag aus Licht and Gnosticism, because elements of Stockhausen's personal declarations he claims to hail from the dog star, that is serious shock academics. Now, of course, we're academics, so we know academics are easily scandalized, and if Catholicism remains problematic, any reference to Gnosticism is anathema for mainstream thinkers. So I'll just cite some more of them. In terms of literature, that's René Girard. Seeing Satan Fall Like Lightning, Luke 10:18, and that's not what Girard talks about, but what I'm going to be talking about, rock and roll. If there are obvious references to hell in the case of Jim Steinman, that's Jim Steinman and Meatloaf, that's Meatloaf, Bob Dylan claims Milton's Lucifer, speaking on the radio, as Aidan Day tells us in his essay in the Cambridge Quarterly, Satan Whispers. Dylan actually claims he made a deal with the devil, but that's neither here nor there, by reading from Fowler's edition of Milton's Paradise Lost, without introduction, as Day says. Dylan quotes him, the almighty power hurled headlong flaming from the ethereal sky, with hideous ruin and combustion down to bottomless perdition, there to dwell in adamantine chains and penal fire, who durst defy the omnipotent to arms. Day continues, we're talking about the devil, Dylan advised his listeners. This is on the radio. You might know him better as Beelzebub, Satan, Lucifer, Mephistopheles, Old Scratch, the monarch of hell, Leviathan. That's a scary thing with Hobbes and Carl Schmitt. The Prince of Darkness, the Antichrist, or as they call him in Spain, El Diablo. The whisper in Day's title, Satan Whispers, is overdetermined. Wilfrid Mellers, in his book on Dylan, A Darker Shade of Pale, offers an ethnomusicological reading of the influence of Hillbilly Scratch on Dylan, and this works as temptation in paradise. And there are so many complexities woven into Milton's language on Satan and Eve that it has inspired both feminist and anti-feminist readings. Both get inspiration. Thus, Day quotes Bob Dylan's epitomization of Satan as prince of the power of the air. Not everybody thinks of Lucifer in that way, but that's one way to call him. Thereby, Milton follows and Dylan tracks the language of St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians. The precision is basic, it's easy, pre-ChatGPT, it's taken, it's lifted from Alistair Fowler's editorial gloss, as Dylan cites this on Milton. Satan had presented himself to the sleeping Eve in the guise of a good angel, and when telling her dream to Adam, Eve relates Satan's words, very Miltonian, "Be henceforth among the gods, thyself a goddess, not to earth confined, but sometimes in the air, as we sometimes ascend to heaven." In Dylan's 1965, Like a Rolling Stone, the contract with the devil is transferred. You always have to transfer the contract, as he names, addresses an unnamed subject on their own, like a rolling stone, as he asks, with not a little cruelty and mockery. It's a woman he's talking to, and it's her come down. Once again, we may think of Eve. How does it feel? Day continues his analysis, telling us that the rhyme pattern in the second stanza invokes the sleeve note pun on I, the self, and I. If we can go to that, maybe we can. I saw Satan fall like lightning, reads, actually he misreads this equivalence, equating the Greek Hades with hell, the same hell of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So he's very indebted to Hegel, much more Hegel than he is to Nietzsche. Nietzsche is a Greekist, telling us, now we can think of Dylan's mystery trap, Dionysus is the same, that's Heraclitus, thing as Hades. Dionysus, in other words, this is Girard, that's why that's in quotes, that's Heraclitus, is the same thing as Satan. That's what's wrong. The same thing as death, the same thing as the lynch mob. Dionysus is the destructiveness at the heart of violent contagion. Now, the next section, I'm not going to be looking at all of it. Misogyny in music, but we need it. Bad behavior. MacLean was a Congregationalist, as I said, and a choir director, and thus he argued with some indulgence that boys will be boys, that there is dissonance inbuilt in the human heart. He singles out the men, it's not the woman. Quoting Genesis, as a shock to deity, the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. By contrast, I said I would get back to Goethe. The Lutheran Goethe gets it right. This is the high theodicy in Faust, who asks his Mephisto to identify himself. Nun gut, wer bist du denn? And Mephistopheles answers, ein Teil von jener Kraft, die stets das Böse will und stets das Gute schafft. I'm part of that power that always wants or wills evil and always creates the good. So Mephisto's unhappy because God is constantly correcting him and what he does. Very Lutheran. So speaks the patriarchy. And MacLean is talking the men, not the woman. And we may think of Stockhausen at the end of his life, his living arrangements, because if you have multiple partners, 2 wives, for example, that's really convenient. If you're an aging gentleman, that's for his convenience. I have cut a whole section on misogyny. You just have to think about Dylan if you want. That's what we really need. But note that musically for MacLean, male and female, as I said earlier, are Pythagorean distinctions, even and odd. Metonymically, misogyny is old news, nothing new there. And part of the problem for some will be hearing Katie Lang, not because she's a lesbian, but because she's a woman singing a man's song. As I analyze her 2005 Juno video, KD, I argue, takes Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah to church. The move is fair. Cohen celebrated for being a Jew from Montreal. This is Suzanne I'm trying to play, who, with his Suzanne, could teach Catholics how to understand their Jesus and native Montreal dwellers, their harbor. But I have to skip to this. I hope I get it. It's always hard.
Now Jesus was a sailor when he walked across the water.
Nina Simone, who sings this, you need a classical voice. She's classically trained. She's a pianist, and echoes from what the composer and musicologist I've already mentioned, Wilfrid Mellors, already the title of his book, A Whiter Shade, that is Bob Dylan's dark orthoxony, as Mellors traces in his analysis Dylan's pentatonic rhythms from the dissemination of Scots, Highland, and other transposed English folk song. This was Mellors' research foci for many decades, so he would know, as of this whole connection with piano, which she also plays, and bongo drums. Recorded, bad recording, but it's what we have, in 1969 at the Teatro Sistina in Rome, helping us to hear an early reference, as we just heard it, to the broken. Here, we recall the paradox of the incarnation, the stumbling block, what it is to be imago Dei. Stockhausen's emphasis reflecting on Lucifer's Traum, telling us that Lucifer wanting the entire world to be dissolved. Recall that Godwin explains this as Gnostic, sings compression of the figures of human music. The tension is on the human in human music. Musical covers. Whose Hallelujah? The Hallelujah Effect, the book, I've also subsequently written an essay on covers, on musical covers, is something that we can think about, and I have an example of that, the realization with Johnny Cash singing Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails' Hurt. We'll just hear a little bit of that. I'm sorry to have to stop that because we'd like to hear it, and that's the point of a very successful cover. There's a reason that many people call this the best cover, bar none, of any cover, for all kinds of reasons, including Trent Reznor, who agrees. Now, in my encyclopedia or handbook entry on musicology, that's what that looks like. Here's what the book looks like in real life. I noted a shift to religion as new old music, referring to Gesualdo and Thales. And inspired by Godwin, we might say Gnosticism too, as Cash renders My Empire of Dirt. When my husband, the political theorist, the late Tracy Strong, died, victim of the vaccine mandates, suddenly and unexpectedly, I found no cover of Cohen's or Dylan's Hallelujah, not even Handel, but Meatloaf singing a folk song, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, terribly controversial in an American context. And Tracy wrote, this was the last book he wrote, Learning One's Native Tongue. So he would have heard all of the overtones, which Meatloaf sang Texas gospel style. Meatloaf's mother was a radio gospel singer, so the recording is terrible. but it's the only recording we have. And the more you can hear of music, meaning the more you can hear his voice, the more it will break your heart. I say this not because I necessarily know, but because I sent it to Nate Barney, a baritone colleague of mine, at bass baritone, sorry, I have a cellist's habits, at Lincoln Center. Nathan Barney, he's some recordings on YouTube. He could hear it. Maybe you can as well. Okay, I'm stopping it there, even though that's really what I want. We can remember Johnny Cash. Everyone I know goes away in the end. What I'm trying to talk about is what music is meant to be about. That's the unspeakable. That's the silence. Writing on love. Elsewhere, I focus on Emma Thompson. I'm going to skip some of the, but we're going to hear just this part.
Pretty good. Only 4 weeks.
I never even knew it had words.
It's Yeats, very famous poet and a lovely poem.
I love and
Okay, now it stops and we don't hear it because that's where the clip ends. And on my leaning shoulder, that's what he likes best. She laid her snow white hand. Now the rest of the film falls apart. It's a complicated thing, but I find intriguing about it, and it's worth looking at if you want, is because if you're interested in music, what the film, it's Ian McEwan's novel, but what the filmmaker tries to show is what Adorno writes about in A Current of Music when he talks about what it is to hear something from outside a music hall, as opposed to being inside the music hall. And that's something that we can think about. That's that section. You can go look at that at some other time. It's only significant because in the film itself, suddenly the sound cuts out because you're outside. And then when you open the door, the sound comes back again when you enter the hall. And that's, again, a reference to Adorno on The Current of Music and symphonic, because the symphony brings you together, but you can only be together if you're in the same room. If you're outside, you are an outsider. Now, no. I said I would show this, but this is too difficult because that's a similarly filmic analysis of Alan Rickman, who sings. He does sing, but he doesn't play the cello, pizzicato. In an order to show him singing, but not show that he's playing the cello, they put in a lot of chaos so that you're distracted and you don't pay attention to the cuts. But we're not going to see that, nor are we going to hear Rickman not singing, but speaking until the very end, but it makes the entire video Charlene Spiteri's Texas of Texas's Star Family. But we're gonna skip that. Why? Because we want to get to Dionysus and Rock again. And ressentiment. It's a very strange, that French word. Nietzsche uses it, but he writes it in French, in his own genealogy of morals. Ressentiment runs throughout rock and pop music, very specifically, and it's always male ressentiment. At stake is presumption. People are going to argue about that. That's fine. Whose presumption? And given the presumption, disabuse. Who disabuses? Dylan's 1964, It Ain't Me, Babe, exemplifies this same point. And we're back again to the Greek kautos heides kai Dionysos, which is Heraclitus, and Nietzsche's own reference to Urschmerz and Urwiederklang, and Nietzsche's reference to Heraclitus because he is a classicist. Dionysos Istatis, according to Heraclitus. Now, the figure, which is what I am going to be trying to talk about, is of Orpheus, is complicatedly musical, inspiring poetry and opera. Plato writes about him in The Myth of Earth, The End of the Republic, with some of the contours of the modern reception of Orpheus evident in Franz von Stuck's 1891 Orpheus. If Meatloaf is the opposite of picture perfect, picture bad Dionysus, oafish, messy. He's even more troublesome as Orpheus, but that's exactly what we have in the 1977 Bat Out of Hell, which replays this myth, and Steinman will spend the rest of his life channeling this via, you know him from The Sopranos, or maybe from some of his current performances with the even more famous Bruce Springsteen, right? That is Little Steven. But that's where Jim Steinman is getting this. And they're 1975 Born to Run, with the language of its mansions of glory and suicide machines, which is still part of the video for I Would Do Anything for Love, though surely one also hears Steppenwolf's Born to Be Wild. Bat Out of Hell is a motorcycle album. Just look at the cover. Now, that also includes the line, very sexist, get your motor running, misogyny like a chrome outline around a car radio dial. Excluded, as the women were, at Orpheus's command, they weren't allowed to learn to participate in the cult of Orpheus, the death rites, which meant they would face death without access, they were Greeks, to the cult ritual practices and initiation, which guarantees, we know this more in philosophy than we ever knew before, a future for your soul. So when they tore him limb from limb, that wasn't because they were upset because he wouldn't date them or go out with them. It was because he wouldn't let them into the secret rites. That was a problem, sort of like not being able to enter parts of the Vatican still today, if you are a woman, or Mount Athos. The exclusion attends the complicated theological place of woman. Are there any women in paradise? Is there, and St. Augustine has views on this, sex of any kind or gender of any kind in paradise? Where are the women? Thus, MacLean emphasizes the male virgin singing at the end of time, and there is a tiny confusion in the expectations of jihadists on the matter. The lyrics of Dylan's song emphasize the singer's lack of interest in the presumed desire of the girl outside his window, where lack of interest, as Hegel emphasizes, you just have to articulate it, guarantees the desire of the other. Think Naomi Wolf's The Beauty Myth, which she writes. She steals this from Naomi steals this from de Beauvoir, who takes it from Kojève. What girls learn is not the desire for the other, but the desire to be desired. It's very dangerous. Now, that's the girl outside the window. That's the one that Dylan is saying that he's not going to be available. And these days, there's a kind of renaissance of the relationship between Dylan and Joan Baez. I'm not going to play that cut, so I might as well just show you that image. And she herself writes her own memory, which is a kind of very different flavor on ressentiment. It's regret more than ressentiment. It's simply going back to my poetry was lousy, you said, right? That's crucial. Where are you calling from? A booth in the Midwest. So she's doing, undoing. Dylan, yes, she does that. I'm not going to play that either. And I'm not going to play portions of I Would Do Anything for Love. Because what I want to get to, in order to get to Messaien, is a slightly different, I can see, talking about time. This is a memory, a recollection, and the future, an anticipation. And I'm interested in the practice of delay. How can you buy time? How can you gain time? Pretending an answer, as men will do, gaming what's sought in the process. She asks if he loves her, and she accelerates, will he love her forever? And he parlays. Okay, now, the backwash in the song gives us a phenomenology, beautifully so, of the surge of Eros, and like a tidal wave in true-to-life absurdity repeated in the promise. I think we're better off hearing him if we can. It's a very long song. It's actually the longest song that's a pop song, because it just can't be that long, but it's that. Bible Belt, he's not breaking his promise. He's not going to cheat. He's not changing his mind. That was then, this is now, like Jacques Derrida. He's keeping his word. He's keeping his promise. All he's got to do is till death do us part, and he's counting on it. Now, the next section, word and tone from Dylan to Messaien. I began By mentioning several hallelujahs, I privilege Handel, picture perfect for a piece that moves in ships. That's like Hölderlin once again, or better said, because Hölderlin is borrowing from the 7th century Greek lyric Pindar for his Wechsel der Töne, the changing of tones, from homophony, or voices following the same melody, to polyphony. And here I'm quoting Jessica McMillan, who's director of hymnology at the New Orleans Theological Seminary. Now, I'm going to say, let's hear that just a little. It goes on, obviously, it's Handel. One of the things that we need, and the reason why, although that was terribly kitschy, was it gives us the words and it gives us the churchly motifs that we need for an oratorio. And although Messaien is certainly received, he's got a handbook and everything, we lack such a guideline, as we already heard from the director of hymnology in New Orleans. And Messaien himself tells us that his commentators, whether they're for him or against him, they miss the point. He says, here, it's always inconvenient, but no one seems to get it. This is his treatise on his 1941 Cateau pour le fin du temps. Music scholars spend a lot of time ignoring or countering, they have counter arguments against what an artist says about themselves. And a century after the so-called new music, the majority of essays and books still reflect on Bach and Beethoven, Mozart and Wagner, and when it comes to the contemporary, maybe Boulez or some other name, as if pars pro toto would suffice. What we know, and it's enough to know, is that Messaien was religious and worse, a Catholic, which is of course a problem, and he was rigorous. So you could say he's actually analyzing what then becomes his version of serialism or the new music, analyzing Beethoven's Fifth, the first movement. This procedure is at the basis of all thematic life. It consists of repeating a fragment of the theme, taking away from it successively, it's minimalism, a part of its notes up to concentration upon itself, reduction to a schematic state, shrunken by strife, by crisis. Messaien, that's a problem with him, grants his confessional fealty. Today we can barely read Augustine. Pierre Hadot writes about this, except as if Augustine is confessing. We don't know what the word means anymore, like Katie Lang, who wrote with Benjamin Clark and Joshua Grange. I took that picture at the Beacon Theatre in 2013, and Katie Lang herself, I confess. We prefer the lyric self-reference and easy sensuality of a Katie Lang. Sexuality is fine. Religion is too much. As Simon Torrechinta writes, catching the note of redemption and faith, by contrast with any allusion to gnosis, he's very careful. Just as the song Veni, Veni, Emmanuel speaks of imprisonment, Messaien was imprisoned at the Stalag 8, a prisoner of war camp in Görlitz, and some mock that it's not enough of a concentration camp because it's a prisoner of war camp. He says, born in the midst of war, that's where that quartet for the end of time comes from, death, frost, and famine. The quartet, although explicitly apocalyptic, is not a fiery requiem striving to translate divine wrath, but rather an intensely devotional, transcendent composition that reaches a realm in which such worldly troubles matter little or not, like the end of Casablanca. In his article in the New Yorker featuring the original Art Nouveau was hand-lettered program, Alex Ross reflects on what he calls a dissonant apocalypse in terms of expectations, featuring episodes of transfixing serenity. He points to 2 louanges or songs of praise and tells us that each has a drawn-out string melody over pulsing piano chords. Each builds towards a luminous climax and then vanishes into silence. The first is marked, infinitely slow, the second tender, ecstatic. Beyond that, words fail. I'm struck by Günther Anders in the German Zuhören, listening to, and lauschen, almost impossible to translate to English, and my own phenomenological reflection on performance practice, which I find often discovers the audience as in dialogue with the composition, articulated by and with silence. Nikki Losef, that was originally like my book, an Ashgate book. I recognized the imprint. Editing a collective volume entitled with the quasi-imperative silence, music, silent music, originally writes on the invisibility of silence in modern reality. That's a quote. And Cage is all about that. In an essay, I note with some amusement the challenges it's being done of broadcasting Cage's 4 minutes, 33 seconds, broadcast by the BBC in 2004 on the radio for the first time. Now, dead air must always be avoided for national security reasons, something radio engineers worry about, such that for the sake of the BBC radio transmission, it was necessary to disable or switch off, this is the quote from them, their emergency backup system designed to cut in when there's an unexpected silence on air. As a doctoral student when I was in Boston, I found Robert J. Lertzema, that's Lertzema's radio silences. He used to have moments of not speaking on air. An oasis of calm in a classical hour that began with his field recording of birdsong, Morning pro Musica. Scholars prefer field recordings. They like recordings. They prefer it to transcription. As Messaien collects, he was old school, so he used to transcribe. And rather than record, maybe his wife would record, but he, or a companion, a student would record, but he would transcribe. Paul Dubois, he would say, told us, listen to the birds. Even if one incorporates literal recordings from birds, as in Messaien's 1955, 1956 Oiseaux Exotiques, one will be challenged in the spirit of Adorno's sound stripe, or as I cite just now, the sonic engineer's reflection, the shift in hearing, not merely from a quartet first performed, I was going to play that, but I'm not going to, in a POW camp to radio, as that's that POW camp, as Anders already chronicles, a play on the acoustic. We already referred to that with regard to the Children Act, on the acoustic heard through a door while you're walking down a hallway, how that changes things. Beyond what Rilke the poet writes, through an open window, a violin yielded itself to you, or Hölderlin's 19th century back garden drifting of a violin playing. Thus, with earbuds and headphones, wired or unwired, for sound in the world, and the interior transformation of the world into one's own personal film. Almost consistently, critics object that Messaien does not, as Lertzema did for his radio show, use recognizable birdsong. We trust recordings. We think birds are machines. We think they don't vary their song. We're wrong about that. They do all the time. Alexander Goer, who's a student of Messaien, gives us a version of this criticism. You can damn with strong praise as easily as you can damn with weak praise. Messaien liked to pretend that he was merely transcribing what he heard when he went to the forests. In reality, it hardly mattered musically which particular bird he thought he was transcribing. His inventiveness and supreme musical personality revealed itself in the way he set down his transcriptions. We'll just hear a little bit of this. Now, I'm not saying that Goer's wrong. I'm simply suggesting that we do something else. In this case, let's listen to the third movement, Abîme des Oiseaux, originally composed as a solo piece for the clarinetist who happened to be there in Görlitz with Messaien. It's performed by Julien Hervé. I'm not going to play all of it, but you can go find it if you want, for a day of recollection in 2021 in the medieval Lawrencekirk. And I'm going to recommend that you listen to the walls, not the clarinet, the walls. To explain that, we'll take another paper. So all I'm going to do is try to add what's behind the Günther Anders reflection on listening as in music and the sociology of the same from his teacher, Martin Heidegger, who writes in The Principle of Reason, the Satz vom Grund, which is 1957, so a year after Günther Anders becomes fairly famous with his first book on the antiquatedness of the human, where Heidegger emphasizes it's important to remember that Günther Anders' father invents the tone resonator, which is a device that's still used to test hearing to this day. His father was William Stern, who also invented the IQ test. So it's a very important thing. But Heidegger says, per contra, we hear, not the ear. If we hear something, it's not simply added to what the ear picks up. Rather, what the ear perceives and how it perceives will already be attuned and determined by what we hear. Be this only that we hear the titmouse and the robin, very different from the American robin, and the Rotkehlchen, so it's a red-throated bird in the German, and the lark, which we just heard, the short-tailed lark. To this, we have, though, despite Heidegger's criticizing Anders, we have to add because everyone prevented him from publishing what would have been his Habilitationsschrift, his musico-sociological reflections on what is needed to listen, to hear if we hear, which is Heidegger's point, to anything, especially music, where privilege reigns, and not everyone is allowed to listen or to have a judgment. Only the same names are typically found in all the indices of the music books. You can just look in the index, it's only the same guys, always the music, same suspects. Training yields to technology. And in spite of every critical thing, that's the culture industry, that's critical theory that Adorno and Anders, it said that Adorno steals from Anders, wrote about technological distortion. We trust our recording devices. One colleague, after a master class I heard him give at Juilliard, complained that it was tough to audition students as they insisted on reproducing recordings live in performance so that they could be admitted to the program. This may be heard in a single note, in the emptiness between notes, as Wilke writes, and in modern musical Tonkunst, as Cage shows that any sound can and will or might do for sound, with ambient sound for music, context, performance. As with Anders, and I mentioned already Herbert Eimert, who is before Stockhausen, so Stockhausen's claim to have invented is a little wrong, or who set Anders into music in Köln. It's online, you can find it. It's the title of Anders' poem, Epitaph for Akichi Kuboyama, as radio, electronic, experimental music. And there's the end of Stockhausen's Klavierstuk Act, or the Lucifer's Traum. Here I have a master's performance by Francesco Paolo at the Conservatorio Cantelli in Novara, Italy. Operate. Now, I ended my lecture in 2022, 3 years ago now, with Messaien, Sublime, on the End of Time. You can look at that if you like. But my point there was only that because the student Stockhausen does something very similar here, keen to avoid early applause. No music audience wants to applaud too soon. Silence is what we listen for. So I read the 2016 Salzburg Festival performance in dialogue with the audience conducting. They're also in a church. The silence of the audience, which in turn, listening, collaborated. As we hear and see Paolo playing Stockhausen's rendering of Lucifer's Dream, he concludes his performance with an acoustic homage to Cage, audibly closing the keyboard, and we have the videographer's shot of the score, which is the real way a video closes, with an image. To end with Nietzsche, as I began with him, he says, "Das verstanden wir vom Texte einer Messe Palestrinas, einer Kantate Bachs, eines Oratoriums Händels, wenn wir nicht etwa selbst mitsingen. Nur für den Mitsingenden gibt es eine Lyrik, gibt es Vokalmusik. What we understand of the text of a Palestrina Mass, a Bach cantata, a Handel oratorio, if we ourselves did not in some sense sing, even if we're silent along, only for the ones who are singing along, is there a lyric? Is there vocal music?" Nietzsche's argument is that in every case, and this is especially true for Handel, but it's also true for Wagner, he wants to argue, it's not about being understood, even though the importance will be to articulate the final consonant when you're singing. He says, everyone who sings, sings out of an inner drive, unbekümmert, ob das Wort einem nicht mitsingenden verständlich ist. So you don't really care if someone, if you're part of the choir, who's not singing along, can understand what you're singing. For him, that's especially crucial to understand ancient Greek, because ancient Greek was sung, not spoken. With Messaien, with Adorno's own music, the same mitsingen also sounds in silence, dying into silence. Silence comes to sound. And maybe I have cut some things, not because out of disrespect, but because I'm hoping there will be dialogue, questions, objections, because that's the best part of any lecture. Thank you.